In this video, we're going to go over cards that have effects when sent to the graveyard from anywhere, and don't have restrictions about being sent to the graveyard by card effects specifically, which means that we're going to leave off cards like Tearlaments and Shaddolls. And at number 10, we have Skullmark Ladybug. This is a level 4 insect monster which has the effect that if it's sent to the graveyard, you get to increase your life points by 1000 points. Now, out of all of the cards in this list, this one is definitely the weakest, because getting life points is usually one of the most minor beneficial effects you can possibly get. However, this card actually saw a ton of competitive play during the Tier 0 Tearlaments format, and the reason for that is because the Tearlaments were a deck all about milling random cards from your deck to the graveyard, and if Skullmark Ladybug was accidentally sent to the graveyard while doing their normal plays, you would gain 1000 life points. And based on rulings about going into overtime, whoever has the highest amount of life points when time is called wins the duel. So, if you simply sided in some Skullmark Ladybugs when you knew you were about to go into time, you could theoretically mill one of these cards in order to get 1000 life points and steal a win right there. And the reason this card was able to see so much play is purely because the Tearlament mirror match took so long to actually play out. So by playing the game naturally without having to stall for time, a lot of tier players were going into time. So a lot of cards which have effects that either inflicted damage or increased life points incidentally were seeing a ton of play in the side decks, which is why Volcanic Scattershot was also seeing play at this time for basically the same reason, because it would inflict finer damage to your opponent when it was sent to the graveyard in any way. Once the Tier 0 format of Tearlaments was kind of hit by the ban list, people in droves stopped using Skullmark Ladybug, because you were no longer milling a whole bunch and games are not going into time as often. And since the actual effect of the card is pretty minor, we only have the number 10 spot on this list, even if it has technically seen more competitive play than a lot of the other cards that are going to come up after it. And at number 9, we have Absolute King Backjack. This is a level 1 Fiend monster which has the effect that when it's sent to the graveyard in any way, you get to look at the top 3 cards of your deck and place one of them back on top of your deck in any order. Additionally, if this card is in your graveyard and it's your opponent's turn, you can banish it in order to look at the top card of your deck. And if it's a normal trap card, you get to set it to the field and it can be activated this turn. If it's not a trap card, then it's sent to the graveyard. Now, this card seems like it's very good support for decks that use normal traps, like Labyrinth. In Labyrinths, they love Fiend monsters and normal traps to specifically remove cards from the field, especially cards and effects that allow them to activate those cards on the turn that they're sent. However, most modern Labyrinth decks don't play this card at all, because they have no problem getting trap cards in the field without random chances of trying to pick one from the top 3 cards of their deck. And in fact, most modern Labyrinth decks either just load up on a ton of floodgates or are very combo based with monsters and their furnitures, so they don't even play a lot of normal traps anymore. Really, the last time this card saw competitive play was actually in Tearlament builds, in order to specifically mill one card from the top of your deck, even if it wasn't a trap card, and to know if it was worth milling or not. It wasn't a super widely used strategy, but if you knew the top card of your deck was an excellent one with a graveyard effect, like one of the 3 Tearlament sisters, you can then just use Backjack in order to force activation of the card in the graveyard whenever you want to go into a fusion. So basically, it was just a way to look at the top 3 cards of your deck and see if there was a tier or an Yugioh card worth milling. However, since it was used in a number of strategies in competitive decks in the past couple of years, this puts it above a lot of the other cards that might have made this list, as there are actually very few cards in the game that activate no matter how they're sent to the graveyard. And at number 8, we have Toy Vendor. This is a continuous spell card which has the effect where you can discard one card to draw a card. And then if it's a Fluffle monster, you get to special summon any monster from your hand. And if it's not, you instead have to discard the card you drew. Additionally, if this card is sent to the graveyard in any way, you can add an Edge Imp Sabers or a Fluffle monster from your deck to your hand. And its graveyard effect is not once per turn. So if you're able to send all 3 copies of Toy Vendor from the top of your deck to the graveyard, you get to search 3 cards, which was definitely a strategy used with some Yugioh Fluffle decks in Master Duel. But in the normal TCG, this card was generally just sent to the graveyard with Foolish Burial Goods instead. There are very few cards in the game that allow you to search from your archetype with a trigger of just being sent to the graveyard in any way. So getting Toy Vendor to the graveyard is usually a main strategy for Fluffle decks because it allows them to search whatever they need in order to pop off. So if it's sent randomly as a mill, sent to the graveyard as cost per Forbidden Droplet, or sent directly with Foolish Burial Goods, it turns all of those cards into a search of one of their mainline engine pieces. There's even cards in the archetype specifically designed to send Toy Vendor from the field to the graveyard in order to get more advantage from it. And while there are very few cards that can search as well as Toy Vendor, there are others, which we'll be going over a little bit later on this list. And at number 7, we have Elemental Hero Shadow Mist. This is a level 4 Dark Hero monster which has the effect that if it's sent to the graveyard in any way, you get to add any hero monster from your deck to your hand, except another copy of itself. However, unlike Toy Vendor, this card does have a hard once per turn on this effect, and it's even shared with its other effect, Or if this card is special summoned, you get to add any change quick play spell card from your deck to your hand. So one of the standard combos with this card is to use a Hero Lives in order to special summon it directly from your deck. Then add Mass Change to your hand, which allows you to send a hero monster you control to the graveyard to special summon a mass hero monster with the same attribute as that monster. And what do you know, the best mass hero monster is Dark Law, which is of the Dark attribute, the perfect attribute for Shadow Mist. However, since both of its effects are hard once per turn shared, generally you just set Mass Change and wait for your opponent's turn in order to send Shadow Mist to the graveyard, so you get the search off of the graveyard effect. And since Shadow Mist can activate its effect no matter how it's sent to the graveyard, it's sometimes also just sent to the graveyard as just a fusion material for the deck that performs lots of fusion summons, or sent with Vision Hero Vion directly to the graveyard in order to get another search. And because this card bridges the hero archetype into the masked heroes, and it has the unconditional search when it's sent to the graveyard doing pretty much anything, it's been a staple of hero decks ever since it was released. And it still sees competitive play in the modern day, even after a whole bunch of new hero support was released. And at number 6, we have Rock Band Xenoguitar. This is a level 4 rock monster which has the effect that if it's sent to the graveyard in any way, you can add a rock monster from your graveyard to your hand, then place one rock monster from your hand on top of your deck. It also has the effect that if it's banished from your field or graveyard, you can send a rock monster from your deck to the graveyard, with both of its effects having a hard once per turn. Now, this card definitely sees play in pretty much all Emancipator builds, which is an archetype all about rock monsters that special summon themselves from the hand, as well as excavating the top 5 cards of your deck to special summon a level 4 lower rock monster to go into their synchro plays. And this card combos very well with the strategy in pretty much every single way. It's a level 4 rock monster, which means it's a target for the Emancipators. If it's sent to the graveyard, you can recover one of the Emancipators from the graveyard, and more importantly, it allows you to stack the top card of your deck with a rock monster from your hand to guarantee you'll be able to excavate a rock monster with the Emancipator's effects. But while the effect is very good, it's generally only played at one copy, mainly because of the hard once per turn, so you'd never want to draw more than one ever, or send more than one ever. But if you do get the card, it does allow you to combo off. And at number 5, we have Naturia Sacred Tree. This is a continuous trap card which has the effect that if it's sent to the graveyard in any way, you can add any Naturia card from your deck to your hand except Naturia's Sacred Tree, which does include the spell of trap cards in the archetype in addition to all other monsters. Now, there's a really good deck in the meta called Runic Naturia, which uses the runic cards in order to control the field and bring out different levels of monsters in order to better match the synchro monsters they go into in order to lock down the field with Baronne de Fleur and Naturia Beast. But also, one of the main playmakers of the Runic engine is using any of the Runic Quick Play spell cards to special summon Yugioh the Runic Wings from your extra deck, which has an effect on summon to discard one card from your hand to search out the Runic Field spell, which the entire engine revolves around. And if you have Naturia's Sacred Tree in your hand, you can pitch it to the graveyard as cost in order to search out your Naturia starters in order to get those plays as well. In addition, they also just play Foolish Burial Goods to send it directly from the deck to the graveyard, and they also mill in the form of Naturia Camellia and Naturia Beast, where Camellia will mill 2 from the top of your deck instead of attributing Naturia monsters for their costs, and Naturia Beast will mill 2 every time it negates one of your opponent's spell effects. And because of this mill that happens incidentally, you're able to feed the effect of Runic Fountain, which allows you to shuffle 3 of your Runic cards back into your deck in order to draw 3 cards. And of course, sometimes randomly mill other copies as Naturia's Sacred Tree in order to get more searches, and some of these decks even play a single copy of Metalfoes Fusion just to draw cards off of these mills. And because Sacred Tree is a card which activates no matter how it's sent to the graveyard, it works perfectly with all of these different effects of the archetype. And at number 4, we have Dotscaper. This is a level 1 Earth Cyberus monster which has the effect that if it's sent to the graveyard in any way, you get to special summon it. Additionally, if this card is banished in any way, you get to special summon it. However, you can only use one of its effects per turn, and both of its effects have hard once per duel clauses. So you can only ever trigger each of its effects a single time per duel. So generally, this card is only really played at one copy in decks that run it. However, in decks that do run the card, it's incredibly easy to trigger either its effects. If sent directly from the deck to the graveyard through an incidental mill, or directly with something like Foolish Burial or Beatrice, you basically get a free special summon. And if you wait to banish it on subsequent turns, you get a second free special summon from the card, like with a Fairy Tale Snow for example. Most cards that special summon themselves from being sent to the graveyard do so on a trigger being sent by card effects specifically, like the entire Shadow archetype's main deck monsters, or even some of the Lightsworn monsters like Wolf. There are very few cards that special summon themselves or other cards when sent to the graveyard in any way, which is why Dotscaper has a once per duel on its effect, in order to try to balance it out. Because if it didn't have that once per duel clause, it would probably be played a lot more than it is now. Because being able to repeatedly reuse its special summon, especially since it also special summons from the banish pile, would just be a lot of value for a lot of different kinds of decks that can trigger it. But thanks to its once per duel clause, it has definitely avoided the ban list. and actually doesn't see much play unless decks can really take advantage of it and don't have any other more valuable engine pieces, as most modern meta decks want to use whatever cards are in their engine instead in order to be more consistent. The last time Dotscaper saw competitive play was in Eldritch Cyberse decks, funny enough, as it was a 1-card combo to set up the Scythe lock. What you would do is just normal summon Dotscaper, use as material to go into Link Disciple. Then you would come back from the graveyard where you could use it to go into Link Devotee. Then you would use Disciple to tribute the Devotee to go to 2 tokens, where you would use one of those tokens and Disciple to go into Artifact Dagda. This would allow you to set Artifact Scythe from your deck. Then you would convert one of those tokens into a Link Devotee, and use Devotee and Artifact Dagda in order to go into Predaplan Verte Anaconda, which would then bring out DPE. Then during your opponent's turn, you would just use DP in order to destroy itself and to set Artifact Scythe in order to lock your opponent out of their extra deck for the turn, which could all be done with a single summon of Dotscaper, just to show the power of cards that can bring themselves out from the graveyard just a little bit too easily. And at number 3, we have Garura, Wings of Resonant Life. This is a level 6 fusion monster which has the effect that if it's sent to the graveyard in any way, you get to draw 1 card. It also has some other effects which aren't really as necessary, but the main reason this card sees play is specifically because of its fusion materials and because of its graveyard effect. This card's fusion materials are any 2 monsters that have the same type and attribute but different names, which makes it one of the best targets in the game for super polymerization. This card is a quick play spell card that requires you to discard 1 card from your hand to use, which allows you to fusion summon using monsters on both players' sides of the field as materials, and can't be responded to in any way, so your opponent's not able to negate the effect of the card with one of their boss monsters. And generally, most decks that end on a board of boss monsters that are part of the same archetype will share types and attributes and have different names, making it a perfect board-breaking tool since they can't respond to it. But in addition to being one of the best super polymerization targets, it's also an excellent graveyard effect to be sent directly from the extra deck to the graveyard. So if you have something like Dogmatic Punishment, which requires you to send a monster from your extra deck to the graveyard to destroy a card in the field with less attack, you can just send Boostfulness to hit any monster with 3500 or less attack, which is pretty much everything, and then use Boostfulness's graveyard effect to send Garura to the graveyard in order to draw a card. So thanks to the Boostfulness and Garura combo, Dogmatic Punishment turns into a +1 disruption to pretty much any monster in the game. So due to both its graveyard effect and summon condition being excellent, this card easily earns a high spot on this list, only being out by the next spot, which has a very similar use because it's just a little bit more useful with its graveyard effect. And at number 2, we have Elder Entity Natis. This card has the effect that when it's sent to the graveyard in any way, you get to destroy any 1 card in the field. Now, it has other effects while in the field, but this card is almost never brought out, and I'm sure most people don't even know what its on-field effects are because it's used almost exclusively for its graveyard effect. And what's so good about this card is the fact that it has 2500 attack and can unconditionally destroy any 1 card in the field. So in the previous example, we mentioned Dogmatic Punishment and Garura being able to destroy 1 card in the field and also draw a card with the effect. And while that is good, the problem with the combo is the fact that it technically requires an extra card to be useful because Garura has very low attack. And since Garura only has 1500 attack, its options of cards it can destroy on its own is very limited. Whereas Elder Entity Natis has 2500 attack, which can get rid of a vast majority of cards in the game. In addition to that, if the card you do need to destroy is a boss monster with more than 2500 attack, you can instead just target one of their other cards with lower attack, destroy it with Dogmatic Punishment, then use Natis's graveyard effect to destroy the other card with the higher attack points. Because Natis turns Punishment into a 2-for-1, and can be used on your opponent's turn because it activates immediately upon being sent to the graveyard. However, in addition to being an excellent Dogmatic Punishment target, it's also a target for Diviner of the Herald. This is a level 2 fairy monster which has the effect on summon, where you can send any fairy from your deck or extra deck to the graveyard in order to increase its level by the level the monster is sent. So in Tearlaments or Sprite decks, what you would do is summon Diviner of Herald during your opponent's turn with Sprite Elf, which would trigger its effect in order to send Natis to the graveyard, giving you the option to destroy one of your opponent's cards on your opponent's turn with a Sprite Elf and Herald set up. Additionally, for Infernoid decks, the main boss monster has the ability to send 3 cards from the extra deck to the graveyard on its summon, and Elder Entity Natis is in fact not once per turn. So if you send 3 copies of Natis to the graveyard for the boss monster, you get to destroy 3 cards in the field. So if there's ever any card which has an effect to send cards from the extra deck to the graveyard, chances are you're going to see Natis in the extra deck because being able to destroy any 1 card in the field is just useful for pretty much every deck. And specifically because it activates from being sent to the graveyard immediately, which allows it as an option to be used on your opponent's turn with Dogmatic Punishment and Diviner of the Herald Elf combos, something not available to Fossil Warrior Skull Knight, which is another fusion monster which can banish itself from the graveyard in order to destroy cards on the field. Since that effect is spell speed 1, you can only ever do it during your turn, which is not as quick as being able to do it during your opponent's turn, like with Natis having to activate immediately upon being sent to the graveyard. And Natis is a good example of why this effect can be beneficial rather than a detriment of having to activate effects right away, purely because of the ability to be usable during your opponent's turn. And finally, at number 1, we have 3 monsters that are currently banned because of their abilities when sent to the graveyard. And those are Eva, Dandylion, and Eclipse Wyvern. Eva has the ability that if it's sent to the graveyard, you can banish 2 other light fairy monsters from the field or graveyard in order to add the same number of level 2 or lower light fairy monsters with different names from your deck to your hand, except other copies of this card. Basically, this card was used in Drytron decks in order to get extra fairies in your hand so that you would have 2 more negates with your Herald of Ultimateness, which is the main boss monster of the deck. That has the effect that if your opponent activates any card effect or tries to summon a monster, you can simply send a fairy from your hand to the graveyard in order to stop it. And since the effect was not once per turn or even once per chain, having a full hand of fairy monsters basically allowed you to shut down your opponent from playing the game. And Eva was very useful in getting more fairy bodies in your hand to feel this effect, especially because of the fact that it activated no matter how it was sent to the graveyard. So what Drytron decks would do is go into Yugioh Carrier, which is a light machine monster that has an effect, where it can target a card you control in order to equip a monster from your deck to the card, which has the same type of attribute. And since Yugioh Carrier itself is already a light monster, you can just target itself in order to equip Eva from your deck, in order to have an easy way to get Eva to the graveyard from the field to search out cards for Herald of Ultimateness. Dandylion has the effect that if it's sent to the graveyard in any way, you could just special summon 2 level 1 tokens with no stats. And the only restrictions on these tokens is they can't be used as tributes for tribute summons during the turn they're special summoned. And what's really strong about Dandylion, and why the card is currently banned, is because the effect is not once per turn, and obviously because it triggers no matter how it's sent to the graveyard. And Dandylion gives you 2 monsters instead of 1, so if Dotscaper was strong enough to see competitive play, simply because it brings 1 card back from the graveyard, imagine the combo lines available to Dandylion, which brings out 2 bodies. Which is exactly what it was used for when it was still legal during Master Rule 4 in the OCG, as it was an integral part of the plant FTK, which would try to get 10 plant monsters in the graveyard in order to win in your first turn, with the effects of Phoenixian Cluster Amaryllis. Dandylion was used of a whole bunch of plant link monsters in order to get materials in order to fill the graveyard as quickly as possible, and then end on Topologic Bomber Dragon, which required 4 monsters of materials, which can be easily facilitated by the 2 tokens you'd be getting multiple times per turn. And because of the plant FTK, both Dandylion and Phoenixian Cluster Amaryllis were put on the ban list. And finally, Eclipse Wyvern has the effect that if it's sent to the graveyard in any way, you could banish a level 7 or higher light or dark dragon monster from your deck, where if this card is then banished from the graveyard, you can add that banished card to your hand. So most of the best Chaos cards are level 7 or higher light or dark dragon type monsters, which include things like Red Eye's Darkness Metal Dragon, Chaos Dragon Legionnaire, and Chaos Emperor, the Dragon of Armageddon. And one of the things that made Eclipse Wyvern so good is the fact that its effect is not once per turn, and easily allows you to search a lot of your best boss monsters. In the current metagame, if this card was ever unbanned, it would be even stronger than when it was originally banned, because we have these new cards in the game called Bestials, which are level 6 dark dragon monsters that can banish a light or dark monster from either player's graveyard in order to special summon themselves from the hand at quick effect speed, which also have effects that impact the field or search dragons during the end phase. These cards are just used as really good hand traps in normal decks, and are excellent extenders in Dragon Link, a deck that can use Chaos Dragons as part of their normal plays, which would love to have unbanned copies of Eclipse Wyvern in order to extend. Basically, Eclipse Wyvern is banned because it searches a lot of really good cards when sent to the graveyard, instead of being constrained to just a single archetype like Naturia Sacred Tree or Toy Vendor is. If there weren't such good level 7 or higher light and dark dragon monsters to search, the card probably wouldn't be banned. But currently that's just not the case. Alright, and that's the video. This video idea was actually chosen and written during my subathon as one of the rewards, so you can thank them for actually thinking of a somewhat decent idea.